Most children mix capital and minuscule letters and they start writing at an early age, like putting capital letters where they're not supposed to be. Some also mirror letters vertically, like writing an E with the horizontal lines going left instead of right. I was not unlike other kids, except for the amount of writing. From the age of 4 until the age of 7, I kept a daily diary of anything I found noteworthy. I remember filling 2 pages of A4 sheets the day I started. I had found a puppy in the yard outside of our house, an adorable little white and ruby fur ball, and after begging my parents to let me keep it, they agreed. I gave it the sketchy name Beauty, and as any normal 4-year-old girl would be, I was ecstatic with glee. I had told my mom that I didn't know what to do with all the happy, at least that's how I remember it, and she had suggested that I write it down. My parents, who were both teachers, had taught me about letters through games and fun as soon as I could focus on them, and as a 4-year-old, I was really good at writing, even though my vocabulary was a bit limited. I just didn't find it very entertaining to read or write. I had a short attention span and would always be drawn to something more fun. However, as my mom told me that it would make me remember and feel my happy all my life, I gave it a try, and I loved it. I found it was extremely fascinating that my own thoughts, as opposed to when I was being told to write, were printed on paper forever and ever. At least that's how I imagined it. Then, as I mentioned earlier, I stopped writing my diaries at the age of 7. More precisely, I stopped the day that Beauty died. I remember my last entry was about how awful I felt right after we had buried her head smashed in from being struck by a car. Since then, I never felt like writing a diary entry again. As I remember it, I had found Beauty twitching and bleeding on the deserted road outside of our house. I had promised to look after her for a while, but I fell asleep on the couch, which was really unlike me. When I woke up, it had already happened, and I have been feeling a deep guilt ever since for having failed her. Not until the age of 21 did I realize that Beauty's death and my diaries were closely connected. I had always assumed that the shock of losing Beauty had made me quit, but now I'm not really convinced. The day came when I decided to go through my old diaries. I was bored out of my mind, and for the first time, I overruled my reluctance to read them. I guess I was afraid of reliving the sorrow of losing Beauty that always crept in the back of my head every time I thought of those diaries. After a short search in my cramped up basement space, I lived in a small flat in a building where all the residents had a small basement space for storage. I located a medium-sized cardboard box with the old diaries in it. After bringing them up into my flat, I sat in my bed and opened the box. I remember I felt a chill run down my spine when I first looked into it. I found nothing I wasn't expecting, but yet I still felt really uneasy. Again, I thought it was because I was reminded of the loss of Beauty. There were 7 books of various size and thickness, and a small stack of loose paper sheets. I had only gotten my first diary book when my parents realized that writing had finally caught on, so at first I had written on loose A4 paper sheets. I picked up the small stack of paper, and after reading the first few lines, I was struck by a wave of pleasant memories. I could remember the excitement and extreme glee of having finally gotten a puppy. The first few days of my diary were pretty messy and very disorganized, and I had to concentrate to figure out every other word. But it soon became easily readable and properly dated. I suspect that my parents taught me that. Still, something was nagging me after the first entry. I could not put my finger on why, but I had a really irritating, feeling that I was missing something very important. It was a bit like an itch that you can't quite reach. You know it's there, but there's nothing to do because you can't reach it. I tried to ignore it and keep on reading, but the feeling kept me from concentrating. So I read the first entry again, and the feeling got stronger. The third time I read the entry, now genuinely puzzled, I felt I knew what it was, but I still couldn't quite locate it. Like when you forget a word and you know what the word means, but the word itself keeps eluding you. I started out by explaining what most little children mix up. I started out by explaining that most little children mix up their capital and minuscule letters. Why is this relevant? Well, on my 7th read through, I noted that even though I had remarkably few capital letter errors, those errors combined spelled two really creepy words: kill beauty. I had a chill run through my body and I shivered slightly. Even though I was completely convinced it was a coincidence, it was still really creepy. In order to prove that to my chills, I went through the second entry. The result was more uncertain chill. My skeptical mind was still discarding it as a remarkable coincidence, but it felt really creepy. The second entry's capital letter errors spelled just do it. In disbelief, I read the third entry through, noting the errors, and my skepticism all but evaporated. It said, do it now. Something here was definitely wrong. It sure as hell was no coincidence, but who could have tampered with my diary? I remember I kept it under my bed when I wasn't writing, and as I was an only child, the only people who had access to it apart from me were my parents, and I knew they would never dream of doing something like this. I hardly ever had friends over, and when I did, I was always with them. So, then did someone do it while I slept? That sent another chill through my body. My rational mind declined that idea as well, as it would make no sense for someone to creep into my room at night to alter my diary with hidden messages that would probably never be found. Besides, I noted, I was certain that the writing was my own. The only possibility left was almost equally as scary as the last. I had to have written it all on my own. Then an idea came to me. I don't know why I thought of it, although I now have my suspicions. But if the capital letters meant something, maybe the mirrored letters did as well. I went back to the first entry and went through it, writing down every mirrored letter on a post-it note. The message wasn't nearly as scary as the others, but it was equally puzzling. It said, I won't. The next entry spelled just no. I was now completely captivated by this mystery, and I spent more than 10 hours going through most of my diaries. I tried to remember the things I had written about and find some sort of connection between the hidden messages and what I wrote in the diary entries. Although it was more and more about beauty, more than I'd have thought, and there seemed to be no real connection. However, I found that the hidden messages were all very much alike. What I came to see as the bad message, the one with the capital letters, commanded me in some way to kill my dog. The good message, the one from the mirror letters, refused. As I got to the last few entries, I felt a sense of dread growing deeper and deeper in my gut. In the second to last message, the bad message didn't surprise me. It said, kill it now. But I found not a single mirrored letter. This entry was the first from my entire diary that had no good message. For some reason, the absence of that scared me more than any other thing that I had found in my diaries. With a shivering hand, I turned the last page. Tears came to my eyes while I read the entries. I fully recalled the loss and guilt. When I had read it, though, when I read it through, I noted that there were no misplaced capitalized letters, but this time there were some mirrored. With a sense of terror manifesting itself in my body, I wrote down the letters one by one, and when I read the single word they spelled, a suppressed memory sprang to life in my mind. I realized that I hadn't been sleeping on the couch at all that day when Beauty had died, and I realized that the guilt I had felt ever since her death was justly earned. The last 6 mirrored figures I found spelled happy. I froze completely. The good message had given in. The bad message had won, and I had killed my own dog. Frozen terror became overwhelming misery, and I cried for what seemed like hours. When I had finally composed myself and felt that I could control my voice, I called my mother. It rang a few times, and then I heard my mother answer it sleepily. Hello? I realized it was past her bedtime. Sorry for waking you, Mom, but I have to tell you something. My voice sounded slightly edgy in my own ears, and my mom, not sounding sleepy at all anymore, said, Well, what is it, sweetie? I said, I think I know who killed Beauty. There was silence on the line for a few seconds, enough to make it clear that she was hesitating. Then my mom said, Yeah. I was very disappointed in my mom for taking time to remember Beauty. She should remember such a remarkable dog right away, but I tried to hide my disappointment as I said, Don't you remember her? Oh, of course I do, dear. I remember your Beauty. Thank goodness it passed. I was so shocked at hearing her say this that I blurted out, How can you say that about our dog? My voice was oozing with blame. My mom sighed and said, Oh, honey, we never had a dog. It was all in your head. I froze once more, this time in disbelief. What? I stammered. This couldn't be true. I remembered my parents taking care of Beauty all the time. But then, come to think of it, I couldn't recall any specific memories of my parents actually interacting with Beauty in any way. I was confused and on the verge of tears once more when my mom continued. You came inside after playing in the yard one day and claimed to have a puppy in your arms. Your father and I assumed it was a game and played along. She paused to breathe and I kept silent while still trying to understand what I was hearing. Then she said, After a few days, we started to get worried when you acted more and more like it was really there. The doctor said it wasn't unusual for kids to have imaginary pets, but you were so intense about it. Sometimes I wondered if you actually believed it was there. Go on, I said, certain that there was more to this story than what she had told. She said, Oh, not on the phone, sweetie. However, 5 minutes of near hysterical pleading made her continue anyway. You passed out one day, she said with a sigh. As we rushed you to the hospital, you were mumbling unconsciously. I remember the exact words. Beauty is getting so big. At the hospital, they found a tumor in your brain. They said it was the largest that they had ever seen on a child. Her voice started to break, and she took a few seconds to compose herself. We did everything we could, but nothing ever worked. The doctors didn't dare remove the tumor surgically. And I don't think you ever noticed what was actually going on around you. All you ever spoke of was that dog. Somehow, you knew you were well enough to stay at home most of the time, and your father and I spent all of the time we could with you, afraid to lose you any day. Then, when you were given a few more weeks to live, Your beauty died. You told us through sobs that it had been run over, and that it was all your fault. We comforted you the best that we could, trying to give you all of our love at once, knowing that you were going to pass away soon. So we played along and buried your imaginary dog. My mother seemed a lot happier as she went on for the next part. We took you to the hospital the next day for your regular check, and your doctor, he was dumbfounded. There was not a single trace of your tumor. It had miraculously disappeared.